Aisha thought her first day at a new school would be just like any other. Nervous introductions, new faces, and the challenge of fitting in. But from the moment she stepped into the classroom, she knew something was wrong. The looks, the whispers, and worst of all, the teacher who seemed determined to make her life miserable. What started as small, subtle remarks soon turned into something much worse. But how far could it go before someone finally listened? Stay tuned to find out. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Aisha took a deep breath as she stood in front of the school building. The glass doors reflected her nervous expression, her dark brown eyes filled with uncertainty. She tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the ends of her long, neatly braided hair, adorned with colorful beads. This was her first day in a new school, and she already knew it wouldn't be easy. As she stepped inside, the noise of chattering students echoed through the hallways. The moment she walked into her classroom, a hush fell over the room. Dozens of pairs of eyes turned to her, scanning her from head to toe. Some students whispered to each other, while others snickered. Aisha kept her head high and walked toward an empty seat at the back of the room. She had learned long ago that reacting to stares and whispers only made things worse. Before she could settle in, the classroom door opened and a woman in her 50s entered. Her icy blue eyes scanned the room before landing on Aisha. The teacher's presence immediately commanded silence. She wore a perfectly ironed white blouse and a black skirt, her graying blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. The way she pursed her lips as she looked at Aisha sent an uncomfortable shiver down the girl's spine. The woman placed her books on the desk and turned to face the class. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Miss Collins. I expect discipline, attentiveness, and respect in my classroom." Her voice was sharp and clipped, as if she had little patience for nonsense. Miss Collins began her lesson, writing on the board with precise strokes of her chalk. After a while, she turned around and scanned the room. "Let's see who's been paying attention," she said, her gaze locking onto Aisha. "You, stand up and answer this question." Aisha hesitated but quickly rose to her feet. She recited her answer with confidence, making sure her voice was clear and steady. She had always been a good student. Miss Collins arched an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Aisha nodded. "Yes, Miss Collins." The teacher folded her arms, a smirk forming on her lips. "Really? Because that's not quite how we would phrase it here. Perhaps you should slow down and try again. Maybe then we'll all be able to understand you." A chuckle rippled through the room. Aisha felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly what Miss Collins was implying. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to react. Miss Collins sighed dramatically and shook her head. "Never mind. Sit down. I suppose we'll have to work on articulation, won't we?" Aisha sank into her chair, her heart pounding. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur. She barely heard anything else the teacher said. The occasional side glances and amused smirks from her classmates burned into her mind. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Aisha gathered her things and hurried out of the room. She could hear some students murmuring behind her as she walked through the hallway, but she kept her head down and moved quickly. At lunch, she sat alone at the farthest table in the cafeteria, poking at her food without any appetite. She had thought the worst part of today would be dealing with new people, but Miss Collins had made it clear that being in her classroom was going to be even worse. That evening, at home, she hesitated before bringing it up with her parents, but she knew she had to say something. "Mama, Papa," she started cautiously, "something happened at school today." Her mother looked up from the dinner table, concern in her eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" Aisha fidgeted with her fork. My teacher, Miss Collins, she treats me differently. She humiliated me in front of the whole class. Her father frowned. What do you mean? Aisha hesitated, then explained what had happened. How Miss Collins had singled her out, corrected her unnecessarily, and made her a target for ridicule. Her mother pursed her lips. Are you sure you're not just imagining it, sweetheart? It's a new school. Maybe she's just strict with all students. Aisha's stomach dropped. No, Mama, it wasn't like that. It was different. Her father sighed, shaking his head. Teachers push students to be better. Maybe she just wants you to work harder. Aisha opened her mouth to protest but saw the finality in his expression. He wasn't going to entertain this conversation any further. She clenched her hands under the table, her nails digging into her palms. They didn't understand. And worse, they didn't believe her. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized something that made her stomach churn. She was completely alone in this. Aisha woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. The previous day had left her exhausted, both emotionally and mentally, but she knew she had no choice but to return to that classroom. As she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, she carefully adjusted her braids, making sure they were neat. She had always loved her hair, the way the beads clicked softly as she moved. It was a part of her identity, something that made her feel proud. But now, even looking at her reflection reminded her of the way Miss Collins had stared at her, like she didn't belong. She walked downstairs, her parents already sitting at the breakfast table. Her mother smiled at her. Did you sleep well, sweetheart? Aisha forced a nod. Yeah. Her father glanced at her. You ready for school? She hesitated, then said quietly, Yeah. No point in saying anything else. They wouldn't understand. As she walked into her classroom, the air felt heavier. Miss Collins was already at her desk, flipping through a thick textbook. When she looked up and saw Aisha, the slight curl of her lips made Aisha's stomach twist. Good morning, class, Miss Collins said, standing up. Today, we'll be covering material that requires your full attention. I expect everyone to be focused. Aisha sat down, opening her notebook, trying to drown out everything else. She kept her head low, hoping to get through the lesson unnoticed. But Miss Collins never let her blend in. Aisha, the teacher's sharp voice rang out, since you seem so eager to take notes, why don't you come up and solve this problem on the board? Aisha froze. She wasn't eager. She was just trying to stay invisible. Slowly, she got up, her legs feeling like lead. She took the marker Miss Collins handed her and turned to the board. The math equation written there was complex, but Aisha was good at math. She took a deep breath and began solving it. As soon as she wrote her answer, she turned to Miss Collins. The teacher crossed her arms and smirked. Interesting approach. Aisha's chest tightened. Is it wrong? Miss Collins tapped her nails against her elbow. It's not about right or wrong, dear. It's about how things should be done. You see, in my classroom, we follow the correct method. Aisha frowned. But my answer is correct. Miss Collins sighed dramatically. But you didn't do it the way I taught the class. You need to learn how to follow instructions. The class giggled. Aisha's face burned with humiliation. She gripped the marker tighter but said nothing. Miss Collins turned to the class. This is a perfect example of why it's important to pay attention, everyone. Just because something looks correct doesn't mean it is. Sit down, Aisha. Aisha walked back to her seat, keeping her eyes on her desk. She heard a few more snickers around her. She felt like disappearing. The rest of the lesson passed painfully slowly. Miss Collins continued to single her out, correcting her pronunciation on words that didn't need correction, deliberately ignoring her raised hand when she knew the answer, and instead calling on other students. Every time Aisha tried to push past it, she was reminded that no matter how hard she worked, Miss Collins would find a way to make her feel small. At lunchtime, she sat alone again, pushing her food around with her fork. She didn't feel hungry. She didn't feel anything except exhaustion. Aisha? She looked up to see a girl standing hesitantly near her table. She recognized her from class. Her name was Sarah. "Can I sit here?" Sarah asked. Aisha hesitated, then nodded. Sarah sat down, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. I wanted to say that what Miss Collins did today wasn't fair." Aisha tensed. "It doesn't matter." Sarah frowned. "It does." She hesitated. "She does it to you all the time." Aisha stared at her food. "Yeah, but no one cares." Sarah bit her lip. "I care." Aisha looked up, searching her face. Sarah looked sincere. But Aisha had learned not to trust too easily. "Why are you telling me this?" Aisha asked. Sarah hesitated again before answering. "Because it's wrong." Aisha didn't know what to say. For the first time, someone had acknowledged it out loud. But what did it change? When she got home that evening, she tried again. "Mama, Papa, Miss Collins did it again today." Her mother sighed. "Sweetheart, are you sure you're not just overthinking it?" Aisha clenched her fists. "She made me come to the board just to embarrass me. She told the whole class that my method was wrong, even though the answer was right." Her father put down his newspaper. "Maybe she just wants to challenge you, push you to be better." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. "She's not challenging me, Papa. She's humiliating me." Her mother exchanged a glance with her father. "We'll talk to your teacher if it keeps happening, all right?" Aisha wanted to scream. If it keeps happening, it happens every day. She got up from the table and went upstairs, feeling defeated. That night, she stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding in frustration. They weren't listening. No one was listening. She had never felt more alone. Aisha woke up with an ache in her chest. She had barely slept, her mind replaying every humiliating moment in Miss Collins's classroom. The way the teacher smirked when she belittled her, the quiet snickers of her classmates, the way her parents dismissed her concerns. It was a cycle she couldn't escape. She stared at the ceiling, wishing she could disappear. But that wasn't an option. She had to go back. She had to face it all over again. The moment she walked into the classroom, she could feel it. The tension, the anticipation. Miss Collins stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed, eyes cold and calculating as she watched Aisha take her seat. Aisha tried to keep her head down, hoping, praying that today would be different. That maybe, just maybe, Miss Collins would decide to ignore her. But she should have known better. The lesson began, and it didn't take long before Miss Collins found her next opportunity. "Aisha," she called, her voice sickly sweet, "since you had such unique problem-solving skills yesterday, let's see if you can handle something simpler." She gestured to the board. "Come up here and read this passage for the class." Aisha's fingers tightened around her pencil. She knew what this was. Miss Collins didn't call on her because she needed her to read. She called on her because she wanted to humiliate her. Slowly, Aisha stood up and walked to the front. She picked up the textbook, her heart pounding. She read the words as clearly and confidently as she could, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Miss Collins sighed dramatically before Aisha even finished. That was interesting, she said, tilting her head. But let's try again. Slower. You need to enunciate properly. It's important to speak correctly if you want people to take you seriously. A low murmur of laughter spread through the class. Aisha's face burned. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep her voice steady as she read the passage again. Miss Collins shook her head. Still not quite there. Maybe you should practice more at home. She turned to the class. Class, do we all understand why pronunciation is important? A few students chuckled, nodding along. Aisha felt like her chest was being crushed. She walked back to her seat, her legs stiff, her hands trembling. The rest of the day blurred together. Miss Collins ignored her when she raised her hand, skipped over her when calling on students, and when Aisha finally answered a question, she acted as though it were a surprise that she got it right. At lunch, she sat alone again, pushing her food around. She wasn't hungry. She didn't want to be there. Sarah sat down beside her. She's getting worse. Aisha barely nodded. Sarah hesitated. I think you should tell someone. Aisha let out a hollow laugh. I did. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? My parents, Aisha muttered. They don't believe me. Sarah's eyes widened. What? How can they not? They think she's just being strict, that she's pushing me to do better. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. That's not strict, that's... She stopped herself, glancing around before lowering her voice. That's wrong. Aisha sighed. It doesn't matter. Yes, it does, Sarah insisted. If no one listens, we have to make them listen. Aisha looked at her, studying her expression. Sarah wasn't just saying words, she meant them. For the first time in weeks, a small ember of hope flickered inside Aisha, but she didn't dare let herself believe it just yet. The morning felt colder than usual as Aisha walked into school, but it wasn't the weather. It was the weight in her chest, the dread in her stomach, the sinking realization that today wouldn't be any different. She had barely spoken at home since last night. Her parents didn't push her. Maybe they assumed she was adjusting, or maybe they didn't want to believe something was wrong. Either way, she felt like she was suffocating. As she stepped into the classroom, she didn't even have time to settle into her seat before Miss Collins called out to her. Aisha, a word before we start, the teacher said, standing near her desk with an expression that sent shivers down Aisha's spine. The other students sat down, murmuring to each other, already anticipating another one of Miss Collins's moments of teaching. Aisha swallowed hard and approached. Miss Collins tilted her head slightly, eyeing Aisha's braids. Your hair. Her tone was sharp, clipped, as if the words themselves irritated her. It's become quite the distraction, don't you think? Aisha's heart skipped a beat. She instinctively touched her hair. What? Miss Collins folded her arms. I've noticed that your hairstyle doesn't quite fit the school's dress code. Long, dangling accessories can be disruptive in a classroom setting. Aisha stiffened. My hair isn't against the dress code. Miss Collins gave a cold smile. I think it's important for all students to maintain a professional appearance. This isn't a fashion show. The way she said it, the way her eyes lingered on Aisha's braids, it wasn't about the dress code. It never was. Aisha felt her throat tighten. I need you to take care of it, Miss Collins continued. Tomorrow, come to class with an appropriate hairstyle. Something more fitting. Aisha's fingers dug into her palms. There's nothing wrong with my hair. Miss Collins raised a brow, clearly entertained by the defiance. Oh? Well, If you choose to keep it this way, I'll have to take measures myself. We can't allow exceptions now, can we?" Aisha's breath felt shallow. She wanted to argue, to scream, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Not here. Not in front of her classmates who were watching the exchange with a mix of amusement and nervousness. Miss Collins turned away as if the conversation was over. "Take your seat." Aisha sat down, her hands shaking under her desk. Her classmates whispered among themselves, some glancing back at her. She tried to block them out. The lesson dragged on, each second feeling heavier than the last. And then the moment came. Miss Collins paced between the desks, stopping near Aisha's seat. The teacher sighed as if she was burdened by some great inconvenience. "I did warn you," she murmured, almost too quietly for the class to hear. Before Aisha could react, before she could even process what was happening, Miss Collins reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a pair of scissors. The air in the room went still. Aisha's entire body locked in place. Her breath hitched. She barely registered the gasps from her classmates, the sharp intake of breath from someone behind her. Miss Collins stepped closer. "This won't take long." Aisha's heart pounded in her chest. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Miss Collins didn't stop. She grabbed a section of Aisha's braids, cold fingers brushing against her scalp. The metallic snip of the scissors cut through the silence. A lock of her hair fell to the floor. Aisha sat frozen. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Laughter, nervous, awkward. Some students didn't know how to react. Others found it funny. A few looked horrified but stayed silent. Miss Collins smiled as she placed the scissors back on her desk. "Much better." Aisha slowly reached up, touching where the hair had been. It was uneven now, jagged, violated. A lump formed in her throat, her vision blurring, but she refused to let the tears fall. Miss Collins walked back to the front of the classroom as if nothing had happened. Now, back to the lesson. Aisha didn't remember anything else that day. She didn't hear the rest of the lecture. She didn't notice the looks her classmates gave her. When the final bell rang, she stood up and walked straight out of the school, her fingers still touching the uneven ends of her braids. At home, she sat at the dinner table, staring at her plate, not eating. "Aisha?" her mother asked. "Are you okay?" Aisha didn't answer. Her father set down his fork. "Did something happen at school?" Aisha took a deep breath. "Miss Collins cut my hair today." Silence. Her mother frowned. "What do you mean?" "She took scissors," Aisha said, her voice hollow. "She said my hair was against the dress code. She cut it." Her parents exchanged glances. Her father cleared his throat. "That doesn't make sense. Maybe she did it in front of the whole class," Aisha interrupted. Her mother sighed. "Sweetheart, are you sure it wasn't just a misunderstanding?" Aisha gritted her teeth. "It wasn't." Her father hesitated. "Maybe she thought she was helping." "Helping?" Aisha's voice cracked. "She humiliated me. She did it on purpose." Her mother reached out, touching her hand. "We'll talk to the school. We'll figure this out." Aisha pulled her hand away. "You won't. You didn't before." She stood up and walked upstairs, her hands trembling as she touched her hair again. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, at the uneven cut, at the strands that were no longer there. That night, she lay awake for hours. No more. She couldn't keep pretending this was okay. Aisha didn't want to go to school. She had barely slept, the events of the previous day replaying in her head on an endless loop. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the snip of the scissors, felt the weight of her hair being taken from her without permission, saw Miss Collins's satisfied expression as if she had done nothing wrong. Her parents had promised to talk to the school, but their reaction had been too calm, too unsure. She had no faith that they would actually do anything. They hadn't before. When she walked into the building, the whispers started immediately. Some students looked at her with curiosity, some with pity, and others with amusement. The damage was done. Everyone had seen it. And worst of all, Miss Collins was still here, as if nothing had happened. Aisha sat at her desk, gripping her pencil so tightly that her fingers ached. She tried to keep her breathing steady as Miss Collins entered the room, moving as though she owned the space. "Good morning, class," the teacher said, her usual sharp tone making Aisha's stomach churn. She didn't acknowledge what had happened, didn't even glance at Aisha as if she hadn't completely violated her the day before. Aisha felt like screaming, like standing up and demanding answers, but she knew exactly what would happen. Miss Collins would twist it. She would make it seem like Aisha was the problem, and everyone would believe her. The lesson began, and Aisha barely heard anything. Every time she looked down at her desk, she could see the uneven strands of her hair falling into her vision. She had tried to fix it at home, but there was no fixing it. It had been taken from her, and there was no getting it back. When the lunch bell rang, she grabbed her bag and rushed out before anyone could stop her. She didn't want to sit in the cafeteria. She didn't want to hear more whispers. She walked to the back of the school where it was quiet. She just needed a second. 1 second to breathe. "Aisha?" She turned around. Sarah stood there, hesitant, her face filled with something Aisha didn't recognize at first, but then she realized it was anger. Aisha looked away. "What?" Sarah stepped closer. "Are you okay?" Aisha laughed bitterly. "Do I look okay?" Sarah's expression darkened. "No, you don't. And that's why I want to do something." Aisha frowned. "Do what?" Sarah hesitated. "Tell someone. Someone who will actually listen." Aisha scoffed. "Like who? The principal? My parents?" "No one cares, Sarah." "I care," Sarah shot back. "And I know others do too. They're just scared." Aisha crossed her arms. "So what? You think telling someone is going to magically fix this?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but it'll make them hear us." Aisha looked at her, searching her face. Sarah wasn't just saying words, she meant them. She really believed that someone would listen. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope sparked in Aisha's chest. "Fine," she said after a long pause, "but if this backfires, I don't want to hear I told you so." Sarah nodded. "Deal." That night, for the first time in a long time, Aisha didn't feel completely alone. The tension in the air was thick as parents filled the auditorium for the scheduled meeting. Aisha sat beside her mother and father, her hands clenched together in her lap. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone around her could hear it. She had spent the entire day feeling anxious, knowing that this moment would either change everything or make things worse. Sarah sat a few rows ahead with her parents, glancing back at Aisha every few minutes. Aisha wasn't sure if it was to offer support or to make sure she didn't run. Miss Collins stood near the stage, speaking in her usual clipped professional tone. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did the principal. Aisha had told Sarah this wouldn't work, that no one would listen. But Sarah was stubborn. She had spent the past day talking to other students, gathering support, convincing others to speak out. Aisha had been skeptical, but now, sitting in this room, she realized Sarah had been right. When the principal finally opened the floor for questions and concerns, Sarah stood up, Her voice was steady, even though Aisha could see her hands shaking slightly. "I have something to say," she announced. All eyes turned toward her. The principal gestured for her to continue. Sarah took a deep breath. "I want to talk about what's been happening in Miss Collins's class." Aisha held her breath. Sarah's mother shifted beside her, confused, but Sarah pressed on. "Miss Collins has been mistreating Aisha," she said, her voice firm. "She humiliates her in front of the class. She picks on her. She cuts her off when she speaks, even when she's right. She—" Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering to Aisha before turning back to the audience. "She cut Aisha's hair in front of everyone." The silence that followed was deafening. The principal's eyebrows shot up. Miss Collins's face barely changed, though a slight stiffness in her posture betrayed her surprise. Aisha's mother turned toward her, her expression a mix of shock and confusion. "Aisha, is this true?" she asked in a hushed voice. Aisha's throat felt dry, but she nodded. "Yes." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some parents looked outraged, others skeptical. A few students whispered among themselves. Then another voice spoke up. "She did it," a boy from Aisha's class said, standing up. "I saw it." Then another. "She's always mean to her. She never treats anyone else that way." More voices joined in. Parents turned to look at their children, whispering questions. Aisha could see it happening, the shift, the realization that this wasn't just one student complaining. It was the truth. Miss Collins finally spoke, her tone controlled. "This is completely out of proportion," she said. "I was simply ensuring that the school dress code was followed. There was no harm intended." "No harm?" Aisha's mother's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood up, turning toward the teacher. "You put scissors to my daughter's hair and you call that no harm?" Aisha had never heard her mother sound like that before. Her father stood as well, his usual calm expression replaced with something much sharper. "You humiliated our daughter in front of her classmates. You've been targeting her, belittling her, and now you're trying to act like this is a misunderstanding?" Miss Collins's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was simply enforcing discipline." "By cutting a child's hair without permission," another parent interrupted, anger in their voice. "By bullying a student?" The principal cleared his throat, clearly realizing the situation had spiraled beyond his control. "Miss Collins, I think we need to discuss this privately." Aisha could see the flicker of uncertainty cross Miss Collins's face for the first time. "No," Sarah's mother said, "we're discussing it right now. Because if this is how she treats students, how many others has she done this to?" The murmur of agreement grew louder. Parents turned to their children, asking them questions, pressing for details. Some of them looked horrified by the answers they received. The principal sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Collins, given the seriousness of these allegations, I have no choice but to place you on immediate suspension pending a full investigation." It wasn't enough. Aisha knew that, but it was something. Miss Collins's face twisted for a fraction of a second before she forced a neutral expression. "I have always upheld the highest standards of education," she said. "This is a gross misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Aisha's voice came out before she could stop it. She stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You made my life miserable. You embarrassed me in front of my classmates every chance you got. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like nothing I did was ever right. And when that wasn't enough, you took scissors and cut my hair to prove your point." Silence fell over the room again. This time it felt heavier. The principal exhaled slowly. "Miss Collins, please gather your things. You're dismissed for the evening." Miss Collins didn't move at first. Then, with stiff, jerky movements, she grabbed her folder and turned toward the exit. As she walked past, her gaze landed on Aisha. There was no remorse in her expression, only cold resentment. The door closed behind her. Aisha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mother turned to her face filled with guilt. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell us sooner?" Aisha's chest tightened. "I did." Her mother's face crumpled. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "We should have listened." Aisha felt something in her chest loosen just a little. Sarah turned around in her seat, catching Aisha's eye. She gave her a small, knowing smile. For the first time in a long time, Aisha didn't feel invisible. She had been heard. The next morning, walking into school felt different. The usual weight pressing down on Aisha's chest wasn't as heavy. The whispers in the hallway were still there, but they weren't mocking this time. They weren't filled with quiet amusement at her expense. Instead, they were murmurs of curiosity, of shock, of disbelief at what had happened at the meeting. Some students glanced at her with something close to respect, others with guilt for never speaking up sooner. For the first time since she had started at this school, she wasn't invisible. Miss Collins' classroom was empty. Her desk, which had always been a symbol of quiet authority and cold discipline, was unoccupied. The usual tension in the air was missing. The silence wasn't suffocating. Aisha sat at her desk, exhaling slowly. The new substitute teacher arrived a few minutes later, a young woman with warm brown eyes and a calm, steady voice. She introduced herself as Miss Ramirez and wasted no time getting into the lesson. There were no sharp remarks, no deliberate humiliation, no twisted games of power. For the first time in months, Aisha didn't feel the tight grip of dread when called on. At lunch, Sarah sat beside her without hesitation. There was no nervous glancing around, no hesitation in her movements. She placed her tray down and grinned. "It worked," she said simply. Aisha shook her head. "She's only suspended." "For now," Sarah pointed out, "but everyone knows what she did. The principal can't ignore it. Even some of the other teachers looked uncomfortable when she left last night. I heard my mom talking to some parents this morning. They're pushing for her to be fired." Aisha stirred her juice with her straw. She wanted to believe that was enough, but something inside her still felt raw, as if the past few months of humiliation couldn't be erased just because Miss Collins was gone. "Hey," Sarah nudged her, "you did it." Aisha looked at her. "We did it." Sarah grinned. "Yeah, we did." When Aisha got home that evening, her parents were waiting for her in the kitchen. Her mother had been quiet that morning, her father more serious than usual. But now there was something different in their expressions: regret, understanding. "We spoke to the principal today," her mother said. Aisha's stomach twisted. "And?" "He confirmed everything," her father said, his voice tight. "And we told him that we won't accept a simple suspension." Aisha blinked. "You said that?" Her mother nodded. "We should have done more from the beginning. We should have believed you." She reached out and took Aisha's hand, squeezing it gently. "I am so sorry, baby." Aisha swallowed hard. For weeks she had been screaming silently, waiting for them to hear her. And now, finally, they did. The next day, the principal announced that Miss Collins had officially been terminated from her position. The students were told that a full review had taken place and that any form of discrimination would never be tolerated in their school. Aisha didn't need them to say her name to know that this was about her. After the announcement, Miss Ramirez stopped by Aisha's desk. "I just wanted to say," she said softly, "what you did was brave. You changed something here." Aisha met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. She wasn't just the girl Miss Collins had tried to break. She wasn't just the girl who had been humiliated and ignored. She was the girl who spoke up, the girl who fought back. And she was heard. Aisha's journey was painful, but in the end, she proved that silence is never the answer. She stood up, fought back, and made sure her voice was heard. No one should have to suffer alone, and no injustice should go unchallenged. What do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story.